A peaceful afternoon in Greenwood Park was about to take a dark turn, one that an elderly woman could have never foreseen. She had come to the park, as she often did, to enjoy the fresh air and the gentle rustling of leaves. The simple joy of sitting on a stone bench, watching children play and birds glide over the tranquil pond, was a moment of serenity she cherished. But that serenity was shattered in an instant. Two police officers, both young and brimming with authority, approached her with stern faces. Their eyes were filled with suspicion, their hands already reaching for their belts as they strode towards her. She noticed them but remained calm, assuming they were merely passing by. However, what happened next was something she could have never predicted. "Ma'am, stand up," barked one of the officers, a man whose name tag read Blake. His tone wasn't just authoritative. It was accusatory, as if she had already been found guilty of something she hadn't even been made aware of. The elderly woman, confused, slowly lifted her gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice gentle, yet laced with uncertainty. His partner, Carter, took a step forward, his hand resting on his holster. "We need to ask you a few questions. Stand up now." A few park-goers turned their heads, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Conversations quieted. The rustling of leaves became the loudest sound in the vicinity. The elderly woman hesitated, gripping the bench's edge for support. "I don't understand. What is this about?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Blake exchanged glances with Carter, before abruptly reaching for her arm. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," he said coldly. Before she could even comprehend what was happening, Blake yanked her to her feet. She stumbled, her weak knees giving way, causing her to fall onto the hard pavement with a gasp. A few people gasped. Others instinctively reached for their phones, beginning to record the scene unfolding before them. "Please," she pleaded. "I haven't done anything wrong." Her cries, however, fell on deaf ears. Carter pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them onto her frail wrists. The rough metal dug into her skin, causing her to wince. That was the moment Mike Tyson, legendary boxer and former world champion, happened to walk by. He had just finished a rigorous training session, as he did every afternoon, and had come to the park to unwind. It was his sacred time, a moment away from the roaring crowds and flashing cameras. A time to simply be Mike, not the fighter, not the legend. As he walked along the shaded path, the sound of distress reached his ears. A voice, frail and full of fear, made him stop in his tracks. He turned toward the commotion and saw her, a small, elderly woman, handcuffed, her face a mask of confusion and helplessness. Something ignited in him. A familiar fire. Memories of his own struggles, the unfair treatment he had endured in his youth, the times he had been looked down upon and misunderstood. It all came rushing back. Mike Tyson had fought against giants in the ring, but the real battle, he knew, was always outside it. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. His towering presence was impossible to ignore. "Hey," he called out, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What are you guys doing?" Blake and Carter turned toward him, annoyance flickering in their eyes. They didn't recognize him at first. To them, he was just another bystander. "Step back," Carter said gruffly. "This is police business." Mike didn't move. Instead, he took another step forward, his sharp eyes locked onto theirs. "That lady's just sitting on a bench," he said, his voice calm but firm. "How's that a crime?" Blake let out a short laugh. "Look, buddy, this doesn't concern you. We're handling this." Mike crossed his arms, his muscles flexing slightly beneath his shirt. "From where I'm standing, it looks like you're roughing up an innocent old woman." The crowd murmured in agreement. A few people held their phones up higher, capturing every second. Carter, growing impatient, squared his shoulders. "I'll say it one last time. Move along before you get yourself in trouble." Mike let out a slow breath, steadying himself. "I've been in trouble before," he said. "Doesn't scare me." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Recognition dawned on some faces. "Wait, that's Mike Tyson," someone muttered. As if on cue, the atmosphere shifted. Blake and Carter finally looked at him properly. Carter's eyes flickered with something resembling realization, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Listen, Mr. Tyson," Carter said, now more measured, "we're just doing our job." Mike took another step forward. His presence alone made the officers tense. "You're doing it wrong," he said bluntly. The elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes glistening with something akin to hope. Mike bent slightly, lowering himself to her level. "Are you okay, ma'am?" She nodded weakly. They won't tell me what I've done." Mike turned his gaze back to the officers. "You got evidence she did something wrong." Blake hesitated. You what?" Mike cut in. "You think she did something. You assume she was guilty." Carter huffed. "We don't have to explain ourselves to you." Mike smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Actually you do," he said. "Because every single person here is watching, and I don't think they're gonna like what they see." The crowd had grown larger. The murmurs had turned into full-blown voices. "She's done nothing wrong," someone shouted. "Let her go," another demanded. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Blake's face. Then, from the distance, sirens. A police vehicle pulled up. The doors opened, and out stepped Lieutenant Taylor, a man with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority. "What's going on here?" he asked, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Blake and Carter immediately straightened. "Sir, we were handling a situation," Blake started. Taylor's gaze fell on the elderly woman, then on Mike, then on the growing crowd. Mike took a step forward, meeting Taylor's eyes head-on. "They were harassing this woman," he said. "For no reason." Taylor's expression darkened. "Blake Carter." His voice was firm. "Did she break any laws?" The silence that followed was deafening. "Well," Taylor pressed. Blake swallowed hard. Carter's jaw tightened. Neither could come up with an answer. Taylor's gaze hardened. "Uncuff her, now." Blake hesitated before finally relenting, pulling out the key and unlocking the cuffs. The moment they came off, the elderly woman rubbed her wrists, her eyes welling with relief. Mike placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You okay now?" She nodded, overwhelmed with gratitude. The crowd erupted in cheers. Justice had won. And Mike Tyson. He had once again proved that true strength lies in standing up for what's right, looking for an easy target. "I want to see your exact reports right now." Blake and Carter remained silent, their expressions shifting from rigid authority to uneasy hesitation. The weight of the moment pressed down on them, and they both knew they had no valid justification for their actions. Unable to speak, Taylor turned to Mike. "Thank you, Mr. Tyson, for stepping in. I will handle this immediately. Thank you for helping us uphold justice." Taylor then turned to the two officers, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "Immediately remove the handcuffs and leave this place. I will handle you two later." Blake, his face tight with frustration, reluctantly pulled out the key and unshackled the elderly woman's wrists. The metal cuffs clattered as they fell away, leaving red marks on her delicate skin. Carter, shifting uncomfortably, backed away, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, erupted into cheers. Someone shouted loudly, "Mike Tyson is our hero." Mike, however, showed no excitement. His face remained calm, his eyes scanning the elderly woman with concern. He bent down, gently helping her up. "Are you okay? I'll make sure you're safe." Tears welled up in her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I didn't know what was happening." Mike helped her stand, his strength steadying her trembling frame. He led her out of the immediate chaos of the park, the crowd parting to make way for them. But even as he walked, he knew this story was far from over. As Mike Tyson helped the elderly woman sit down on a bench away from the scene, he turned back to face the crowd and Lieutenant Taylor. His expression was no longer just filled with anger. It carried the weight of determination and responsibility. The crowd, though calmer now, remained. People waited to see what would happen next. Some still held their phones up, capturing every second. Mike stepped forward, his voice deep and resonant. Today, we witnessed something that should never happen: abuse of power. An elderly woman who did nothing wrong was harassed and mistreated by those who were supposed to protect her. If you weren't here, would this have stopped? Would justice have been served? The crowd roared in agreement. A man shouted, "We see this happening all the time, but no one ever stands up." Mike nodded, his gaze moving across the people in front of him. "That's why I can't stay silent. This isn't the first time things like this have happened, but it must be the last time we let it happen without fighting back. I don't know this woman, but I know she didn't deserve to be treated like that. And I know we all have a responsibility to protect what's right." Lieutenant Taylor stepped forward, raising his hand to request silence. His voice carried over the murmurs. "I understand your outrage. I'm a police officer too, and I am ashamed to witness the actions of my two colleagues. What happened today does not reflect the values of our force. I promise to conduct a thorough investigation and hold those responsible accountable." Mike stepped closer, his sharp eyes meeting Taylor's. "Promises are good, but actions are better. I hope you do what you say, not just to address these two officers, but to look at the entire system that allowed this behavior to exist." Taylor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. I will personally oversee this investigation. Abuse of power will not be tolerated under any circumstances." Mike turned back to the crowd, where all eyes remained on him. With the calm of a champion, he said, "We can't let things like this continue. The police aren't our enemies, but those who abuse their power need to be held accountable. Today, we stood up together. Let's continue to stand together, not just for one person, but for all people." Applause erupted from the crowd. A young woman held up her phone, filming and declaring loudly, "Mike Tyson isn't just a legendary boxer. He's a hero for justice." A middle-aged man shouted, "We stand with you, Mike. Justice must be served." Mike turned back to help the elderly woman stand up. She was still trembling, but her eyes were no longer filled with fear. She looked at Mike, her voice hoarse. "Thank you, young man. I didn't know what would have happened without you." Mike smiled gently, his voice full of reassurance. "No need to thank me. I was just doing what anyone should do." He slowly led her out of the park, while the crowd remained, some continuing to film, some still discussing what they had just witnessed. Mike knew that his actions today were just a small step, but they had planted hope in the hearts of those who saw them. As Mike left, Taylor turned back to Blake and Carter, his voice growing colder. "You two better be ready. This won't be ignored. You've brought shame to our entire police force." Carter tried to object, but Taylor raised his hand to stop him. "I don't want to hear any excuses. We will handle this properly. Now, leave this place immediately." Blake and Carter, now devoid of any pride, reluctantly walked away under the scornful gazes of the crowd. Mike Tyson, on his way to ensure the elderly woman got home safely, thought about what had just happened. He knew he wasn't the one to change the entire system, but today's small action had created a significant impact. And that's how change begins, with a single brave action, with a decision not to remain silent in the face of injustice. As Mike Tyson left with the elderly woman, the incident in the park quickly spread across social media, thanks to the videos recorded by the crowd. Within hours, images and footage capturing the two officers abusing their power, along with Mike Tyson's stand for justice, became the center of public attention. Public pressure forced the police department to take immediate action. Lieutenant Taylor decided to suspend officers Blake and Carter pending an investigation. An independent investigation team from the Department of the Interior was established to thoroughly examine the officers' actions and the systemic issues that allowed them to happen. The investigation team quickly gathered evidence, including videos from the crowd, testimonies from Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha Johnson, and the officers' previous records. The videos clearly showed the elderly woman sitting quietly on the bench, exhibiting no suspicious behavior, while the two officers used unnecessary force, throwing her to the ground and handcuffing her. Testimonies from Mrs. Martha and Mike Tyson further reinforced the evidence of police brutality and negligence. The investigation also found that Blake and Carter had multiple past complaints regarding abuse of power, but these complaints had been ignored or lightly dismissed. Protests began outside the police station, with banners demanding justice and police reform. The media continuously reported on the incident, and Mike Tyson became a powerful voice advocating for accountability. In an interview Mike shared, "Those without a voice need to be protected, not threatened." His words resonated with millions. Human rights organizations joined the call for justice, demanding the police department provide transparent answers. Blake and Carter were summoned before an internal disciplinary committee. Blake attempted to defend himself, claiming they were simply doing their duty and acted swiftly to ensure public safety. However, the videos from the scene dismantled their defense. The committee pointed out that they had no concrete evidence against Mrs. Martha and had bypassed all basic verification procedures. Ultimately, the committee decided to dismiss Blake and Carter for abuse of power and severe violations of professional ethics. Their records were forwarded to the Department of Justice for consideration of criminal charges. The police department publicly committed to reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. When asked about the outcome, Mike Tyson responded, "It's a step in the right direction. The era of silence is over. Justice must always be defended, no matter who steps up to fight for it." The events in the park and Mike Tyson's decisive actions ignited a wave of change within the police system. Public pressure combined with Lieutenant Taylor's commitment to reform pushed the police department into implementing a comprehensive renewal plan to restore community trust. Lieutenant Taylor announced mandatory training programs for all officers focusing on professional ethics, cultural awareness, and nonviolent crisis intervention skills. These courses emphasize that the role of the police is not to control, but to serve and protect. A new complaint handling system was also introduced, allowing citizens to report abuse anonymously, with all complaints to be reviewed and investigated independently by an external committee. Officers were encouraged to report misconduct within their ranks, without fear of retaliation. Though not an official member of law enforcement, Mike Tyson became a prominent advocate for these reforms. He frequently attended community meetings, sharing his experience and urging citizens to remain vigilant in the fight for justice. In one passionate speech, he reminded the people that today's injustice could not be ignored, that power unchecked would always lead to oppression, and that their unity was their strength. His words resonated deeply. The crowd, emboldened by his stance, echoed their support. Some held signs, others filmed the moment, ensuring that his message would reach far beyond the gathering. Lieutenant Taylor, standing before them, acknowledged the failures of the system and vowed to ensure accountability. However, Mike remained firm, reminding him that promises meant little without action, and that the system enabling such behavior needed to be dismantled, not merely patched. Determined to see justice served, Taylor committed to personally overseeing investigations into misconduct. No officer, regardless of rank, would be immune to scrutiny. Mike addressed the crowd once more, emphasizing that the fight was not against law enforcement, but against those who corrupted it. The real enemy was unchecked power, and only by standing together could they prevent further abuses. Applause erupted. A young woman recorded the scene, declaring Tyson a hero of justice. A middle-aged man voiced his support, reinforcing the demand for accountability. Meanwhile, the elderly woman, still shaken but no longer fearful, turned to Mike, her voice filled with gratitude. He assured her that he had only done what anyone should, reaffirming that justice was a collective responsibility. As Mike helped the woman leave, Taylor turned his attention to the disgraced officers, his tone ice-cold. There would be no leniency. Blake and Carter, stripped of their authority, were ordered to leave immediately under the unforgiving glares of the community. They had brought shame upon the badge they once wore, and their actions would not be forgotten. The events of the day spread rapidly across social media. Videos capturing the abuse of power and Mike Tyson's intervention dominated headlines. Public outrage forced the police department to take immediate action. Under intense scrutiny, Taylor suspended Blake and Carter, launching an independent investigation through the Department of the Interior to assess not only their actions, but also the deeper failures within the system. The investigation gathered substantial evidence, recorded footage, testimonies from Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha Johnson, and past complaints against the officers. The footage alone was damning. It clearly showed the elderly woman sitting peacefully before being aggressively subdued without cause. Additional testimonies reinforced the pattern of abuse, and an alarming revelation surfaced. Blake and Carter had multiple previous complaints of misconduct that had been systematically ignored. Protests erupted outside the police station, demanding not only justice for Mrs. Martha but broader police reform. Media outlets covered the incident extensively, amplifying the voices of those who had suffered similar injustices. Mike Tyson, now a recognized advocate for the oppressed, used his platform to push for meaningful change, stating in an interview that those without power must be protected, not persecuted. Human rights organizations joined the fight, exerting further pressure on law enforcement agencies to implement transparent policies. The disciplinary committee convened, forcing Blake and Carter to answer for their actions. Blake attempted to justify their behavior as standard procedure, but the overwhelming evidence shattered his defense. The committee exposed their failure to follow protocol and their blatant abuse of authority. Carter, seeking leniency, pleaded for forgiveness, but Taylor remained resolute. Chances had been given before, but trust had been irreparably broken. The final verdict was decisive. Blake and Carter were dismissed for abuse of power and severe ethical violations. Their records were forwarded to the Department of Justice for further legal proceedings. Criminal charges, including unlawful use of force and human rights violations, loomed over them. The police department publicly announced the decision and outlined additional reforms to prevent future abuses. When asked about the outcome, Mike Tyson acknowledged it as a necessary step forward. However, he warned that one victory did not mean the battle was won. The message was clear. Those who wield power unjustly would no longer go unchallenged. He continued his advocacy, attending community forums and supporting policies aimed at ensuring law enforcement remained accountable to the people they served. For Mike, the incident in the park had been more than just a moment of intervention. It had become a symbol of a larger fight. The people had been awakened, and silence was no longer an option. Reform and change require action, not just words. For Mike Tyson, this incident was more than just a confrontation in the park. It was a reminder that justice must always be protected, no matter who takes a stand for it. The events that unfolded, along with Mike's decisive actions, became a catalyst for significant change within the police system. Under mounting public pressure and Lieutenant Taylor's commitment to reform, the police department initiated a comprehensive renewal plan to rebuild community trust. Taylor announced mandatory training programs for all officers, focusing on professional ethics, cultural awareness, and nonviolent crisis intervention. These lessons reinforced that the role of law enforcement was not to dominate, but to protect and serve. A new complaint handling system was introduced, enabling citizens to report abuses of power anonymously. Each complaint would undergo thorough, independent investigation by an external committee, ensuring transparency. Officers were also encouraged to report misconduct within their ranks, without fear of retaliation. Though not officially part of the police force, Mike Tyson became a vocal advocate for reform. He attended community meetings, shared his experiences, and urged the public to remain engaged in the fight for justice. In one impassioned speech before a large crowd, he declared, "This isn't just about an elderly woman in a park. It's about all of us, a system that needs to change. If we don't stand up, who will?" His presence at these gatherings not only inspired the public, but also drew media attention, keeping the demand for reform in the spotlight. He emphasized that real change requires persistence, unity, and collective action. The impact of these changes soon became evident. Younger officers, particularly newcomers, displayed a greater commitment to building trust with the community. Various outreach programs were established, bridging the gap between law enforcement and the public. Officers actively participated in meetings held in schools, churches, and neighborhoods, listening to concerns and addressing misconceptions. Mrs. Martha Johnson, the elderly woman who had been the victim of police brutality, became a symbol of the movement. She stood beside Mike Tyson at meetings, sharing her experience and urging others not to remain silent in the face of injustice. Her voice, once silenced by fear, became a beacon of resilience and courage. The story of Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha transcended the city where the incident took place, spreading across the nation. It became a symbol of unity and the power of standing against injustice. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForMartha and #StandWithMike fueled discussions and encouraged individuals to share their own encounters with injustice. Mike continued to push for reform, not just within law enforcement, but also in education and community development. He advocated for programs that instilled values of fairness and respect in young people. His message was clear: true change starts with education and a commitment to doing what is right. Mrs. Martha, now fully recovered, lived in peace, embraced and protected by her community. She often reflected on that fateful day, saying, "I thought I wouldn't see another tomorrow, but Mike stood up. Because of him, I regained my faith in people and justice." The story of Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha is a testament to the power of courage and unity. It proves that even in the face of adversity, justice can prevail when people stand together. Though systemic change does not happen overnight, every action, no matter how small, contributes to building a fairer society. For Mike, the greatest achievement was not fame or recognition, but knowing he had chosen to act when it mattered most. He understood that his stand against injustice had given hope to many, and he remained committed to the ongoing fight for fairness and equality. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.